Jinnah was the creator of a state which never existed on the map of the world. And this is something very unique because there is hardly any example where a person could achieve a new country.
He was he was a colossus, really. I don't think there was one leader who inspired so much awe, respect, and affection at the same time. There was such total faith in his honesty, integrity, his intention, and exactly that he meant whatever he said.
I knew then, of course, which we know now, that it would be impossible to replace. That he left a tremendous void. He has risen above the normal position occupied by a great leader, and he has gone into the Valhalla. He virtually belongs to the pantheon, as it were, of a transcendental personality who is above reproach. I think he merits it to the extent that mortals do. He was obviously cast in that extraordinary mold of classical greatness.
The people, of course, had many hopes in Jinnah because he was the only leader which the Muslims had produced for a very long time who could deliver the goods. It was only this so-called westernized Muslim who somehow or the other led to some positive results, gave them a state. That is why there was such disillusionment on his death, because the Muslims didn't know what to do. And it was with that spirit that the moment they learned that he has died, there was a flock and rush towards the governor's house where his body was lying. I remember because it was lying in the courtyard outside the governor's house.
And I remember there was sort of a very eerie silence all around. Nobody was really weeping and wailing at that time. And there was just a stunned silence, because I think most people didn't expect to think that he was about to die, that he was as ill as he was.
There was a sea of humanity sobbing and wailing. You could hear distant echoes of the sobbing and wailing. And then lowering of his body in the grave, firing of the volley, the last post. Miss Jinnah and Dina Wadia, the daughter, coming up to the grave and looking down. It was a very, very trying moment.
Oh, it was massive. I've never heard so many people. I mean, but the mourning and crying and thousands, lakhs of people. But that was to be expected. That's very Indian, and very Pakistani, both. But anywhere, something like that. Remember that Pakistan had only been going for a year and something, so it was very emotional.
The frontier between India and Pakistan. Here, every evening, the border police on each side lower their national flags. But behind the colour lies hostility. The two nations have gone to war 3 times in 5 decades. Almost all Pakistanis are Muslim. Their nation is now an Islamic state. Across the border, although 4 out of 5 Indians are Hindus, there's still a substantial minority of Muslims. On August 13th, 1947, the last Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten, swept into Karachi for a celebratory banquet. It was hosted by Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
I got this amazing sense of his power, of the potency of the man. Here is Pakistan's King Emperor, Archbishop of Canterbury, Prime Minister, Speaker, all rolled into one formidable Qaid-e-Azam.
Qaid-e-Azam, meaning great leader, was the title Jinnah's followers had given him. Yet at this moment of his greatest triumph, he seemed strangely aloof.
I was responsible for the bodyguard. Mountbatten went through the process of introducing me. The Qaid-e-Azam listened to for a minute or so, and then retired. So I don't think beyond the call of duty, he enjoyed the pomp and ceremony excessively, but he played his part, I think.
There was no sense of exhilaration or of excitement. He was reflective, reserved, quiet, still.
Jinnah already knew from the huge number of refugees pouring into Karachi that Pakistan was being born at a price. But that night, no one foresaw the full scale of the bloodshed to come. The next morning, Jinnah and his sister, Fatima, drove from Government House to the new Parliament for the transfer of power. The Mountbattens followed, amid a final display of British pomp. Jinnah assured Mountbatten of Pakistan's goodwill towards Britain.
Your Excellency, I thank His Majesty, the King, on behalf of the Pakistan Constituent Assembly and myself for his gracious message. Yes, we are parting as friends, and I sincerely hope that we shall remain friends.
Britain's departure brought glee. Partition would bring horror. In British India, Muslims had lived as majorities in the northwest and northeast. These areas formed the basis for West and East Pakistan. The provinces of Bengal and Punjab had only small Muslim majorities and were to be partitioned. In Punjab, this would leave the Muslims in Pakistan and Hindus and Sikhs in India. Many were frightened of being caught on the wrong side and had already left their homes. But on the night of independence, the new boundaries hadn't yet been announced.
I think the Mountbatten did really want a happy night. And there wasn't going to be a happy night if the boundary award had been announced. This was going to lead, in the Punjab at least, to widespread disturbances. Probably nobody thought that there would be an entire, virtually 100% shift of populations between the East and the West Punjab.
The night of the 14th of August, there had been a pitched battle in Lahore railway station with about 60 people killed. When the governor left on the early morning of the 15th by air, he looked down on the smoke of a flaming city.
In Lahore, Muslims slaughtered non-Muslims. Across the new border, in Amritsar, Sikhs and Hindus killed all the Muslims they could find.
You can't imagine what atrocities were committed. Slaughtering people, raping women, killing children, looting properties and things like that, you see. Oh, it was the greatest bestiality you could ever imagine, on both sides.
While the mobs rioted, the new nation's upper crust watched Jinnah being sworn in as Governor-General.
There was not a flutter of excitement with him. But the rest of the country was very excited. And my father-in-law did the swearing in because he was the first Chief Justice. And there was just a small group of people at that time. And so you felt even happier because you didn't have to, you shared your happiness only with the people who had been working for this day.
Jinnah, now installed at Government House, addressed his people.
August the 15th is the birthday of the independent and sovereign state of Pakistan. At this supreme moment, my thoughts are with those valiant fighters in our cause who readily sacrificed all they had to make Pakistan possible.
There was information from the Indian government that a refugee train is due to arrive. Muslim refugees from other places. And I remember twice, not once, twice. When the train compartments were opened, they were full of dead bodies. They had been slaughtered. It was a horrible sight I can't get over. Then these people who came on foot and on horses or bullock carts or something, their breasts cut off, worms streaming down their wombs, and in a terrible state. And when they would relate their experiences, I used to be very upset, very upset. And I thought, who wants to live in a country where you are killed because you are a Muslim? I said nothing. I'm good. I made up my mind. I just wanted to be out of that atmosphere.
And what did you sacrifice in leaving Bhopal?
All the property, that is all. The allowances, the wealth, the palaces, what more?
1 million people died. 1 million Hindus and Muslims across the border, and 10 million people were uprooted. The biggest price that any country ever paid for such kind of operation. The Pakistan that ultimately Jinnah got, and the basis on which he got, was based on hostility, the basis of hate.
"50 years of suspicion between India and Pakistan have made it difficult to talk objectively about Jinnah. In India, he's usually portrayed as a demon, while in Pakistan, he's been almost deified as the father of the nation. And yet, for most of his political life, Jinnah had been anything but a Muslim nationalist. His birthplace, like that of the state of Pakistan, was Karachi.
Karachi was very quiet, very clean, and the streets were washed every night. And I think it was a beautiful city, and Qaid-e-Azam was very fond of Karachi. Whenever he came to Karachi, he said, "I've come home." And there was this incident when we were going to Hawke's Bay. My father was taking him in the car, and we were all with them. And he turned around as we passed Kharadar, where his house is. And he said, "This is where I was born. And this is why I like Karachi, because I feel like I'm coming home."
Today, the house in Kharadar is a museum. Like Jinnah's mausoleum, it's become a shrine to his memory. Legend has it that as a child, he went with his father to a law court in Karachi. Seeing his first gowned advocate, he declared, "I want to be a barrister." The other great influence on the young Jinnah was business. 19th century Karachi was a trading post. In the colonial economy, only raw materials could be exported, while all finished goods were supplied from Britain. Jinnah's father was a trader in imports and exports, who prospered to such a degree that he went into banking. Brought up amid the bustling surroundings of Karachi's textile market, Jinnah's early lessons were in the realities of money-making. An acute business-mindedness would stay with him all his life, and probably marked him more than his formal studies. He changed schools often, but spent most time here at Sindh Madrasa. In later life, he came to believe that only education would be the Muslim's gateway to freedom and peace.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم صدق الله العظيم.
Drum के साथ. Ready? 1, 2, 5, 6, eyes. Again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
What is your country name?
My country name is Pakistan.
Very good. And what is our religion?
Our religion is Islam.
Good. What is our national dress?
Our national dress is Shalwar Kameez.
Very good. Who is the founder of Pakistan?
Qaid-e-Azam is the founder of Pakistan.
Very good.
Qaid-e-Azam was a devoted and honest leader. Qaid-e-Azam never worked for his personal gain or fame. Qaid-e-Azam devoted all his time and his energy for the freedom of Pakistan. Qaid-e-Azam's lesson is unity, faith and discipline is the key of success for us. So my dear friends, we should remember his historical words, which are work, work and only work. Thank you, Qaid-e-Azam Zindabad.
When Jinnah was growing up in the 1880s, Karachi was booming. The recent opening of the Suez Canal had edged it ahead of Bombay as British India's nearest port. But Karachi was still small enough to make a bright boy stand out. Jinnah caught the eye of an English businessman who recommended him for an apprenticeship in the imperial capital, London.
He grew up and to be 16, and then he wanted to go to England. He came from a very well-off family, and they were merchants, and he didn't want for anything. I mean, there was no struggle or anything like that. And his father decided that perhaps he should send his son to England for further. And he wanted to go. But his mother was not very happy. She was very upset.
Though Jinnah was determined to leave his provincial background, he obeyed his mother's wishes and married a girl from the same Khoja community. A few days after the wedding, barely 16 years old, he sailed alone for London. "I will return a great man from England," he wrote to his cousin. "And not only you, but the whole country would be proud of me. Would you not be happy then?" Jinnah soon forsook his business apprenticeship for law. He enrolled for the bar at Lincoln's Inn and studied in the reading room of the British Museum. That first life in London was a shock for the boy from Karachi, as he later recalled. I found a strange country and unfamiliar surroundings. I did not know a soul, and the winter and the fogs upset me a great deal. But I soon settled down and was quite happy. In the visitors' gallery of the House of Commons, Jinnah awoke to politics. There he heard the maiden speech of the first Indian MP, Dadabhai Naoroji. If Naoroji's nationalism gave Jinnah an ideal, it was the principles of Parliament which supplied him his method.
He used to go and visit British Parliament, and he imbibed that spirit. You see his speeches in the Assembly. They were on the same pattern. He has publicly said that when you speak English, you must speak as far as possible like an Englishman.
He was very British in his own character. That is the funny part, you see. He was so British, it's just not true. The way he behaved, the way he lived, the way he ate, the way he stood. Everything that he did was very, very British.
While Jinnah was in London putting the finishing touches to his new persona, the family business was foundering. But Jinnah, set on qualifying as a barrister, ignored his father's calls home.
And he said no. He didn't want to go back. He wanted to finish everything and finish his education and so on. And he did.
When Jinnah did return, it was not to Karachi. While he'd been away from India, his child bride had died, as had his mother. Bombay was to be his base for 50 years. At first, life was far from easy. Jinnah moved into the railway hotel, enrolled at the High Court, and waited for clients.
And then he said, when I started, I didn't have enough money even to travel by tram or bus. Most of the time I would walk. And then he said, there is always room at the top, but there is no lift. You have to struggle, and struggle very hard. And then he mentioned about himself.
Do you know, 2 or 3 years before I became a magistrate, I had a very bad time, and I used to go every other night, or almost every night, to the Watson's Hotel billiard room. It was a famous hotel in those days, and I used to take on people at billiards for a wager. And that is how I supplemented my otherwise meager resources. Watson's Hotel is now a crumbling warren of offices and apartments. The solitary reminder of its former identity is this initial W. Jinnah's luck turned when he was made a temporary magistrate. This was to boost his status and his earnings, when after 6 months he returned from the bench to the bar.
He was so clear, so convincing. Most complicated case, he says, he would break up in such a way and present it in a masterly fashion that he would be able to persuade the judges. But he could thrill the juries.
Successful Indian barristers like Jinnah could still be the objects of patronizing or racist British attitudes.
He could stand up to any judge. And in the early days, I regret to say that some of the British judges used to behave in a little odd fashion with the Indian lawyers. He was very critical, in fact, more critical than many of the Congress leaders, because he was opposed to colonial rule, the British domination in India. From the beginning, he was demanding self-rule, and then he demanded independence not only for the Hindus, but for Muslims as well.
When Jinnah entered politics, it was as a liberal nationalist, like his old hero, Naoroji. The grand old man was presiding over the 1906 session of the Indian National Congress, now calling for self-government. Jinnah was an enthusiastic recruit. Later, the same year, the Muslim League was formed by a group of wealthy Muslims, including the Aga Khan, Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah, who served as the League's president from 1907 to 1912. Concerned to safeguard the rights and interests of Muslims, the League devoted its early efforts to their recognition and protection as a distinct community within the existing framework of British rule. Such loyalism made no appeal to Jinnah, who refused to join until the League embraced the nationalist aims of Congress.
If you read what Jinnah said and did right from 1906, when he really entered active politics, you cannot find a better explanation of the Hindus and Muslims coming together, emphasizing the commonality between them.
In 1915, when Mohandas Gandhi returned from South Africa, Jinnah gave a garden party. Thanking his host, Gandhi publicly singled him out as a Mohammedan. The tactless description set an uneasy tone for a relationship which would have profound consequences for the subcontinent. Jinnah resented being typecast as Muslim when his manner and dress were so westernized and modern.
When Gandhi came from South Africa, my father was already an established politician.
What would they have had in common which would have led them to understand each other?
Well, I think the original thing that was in common was how to get the British out. That was the, I mean, you know, how to get India independent.
Jinnah came to be known as the ambassador for Hindu-Muslim unity, following the 1916 Lucknow Pact between Congress and the League. This was the culmination of his efforts to achieve a united front, and though the pact would never be implemented, it marked the peak of Jinnah's career as an Indian nationalist. He was now a star of Bombay's high society.
Bombay was the first city of India, and there was a very sophisticated Indian bourgeoisie. It flowered in a way it flowered in no other city around the first quarter of the present century. Now, Jinnah belonged to that world, and he was a very cosmopolitan and extremely sophisticated and cultivated member of this particular class. He moved in these particular circles. He belonged to this circle through the success he had earned for himself at the bar. He was one of the most distinguished members of the Indian bar.
Most of Jinnah's close friends belonged to Bombay's prosperous Parsi community. He used to dine at the elegant Bombay residence of Sir Dinshaw Pettit. He met Sir Dinshaw's daughter Rati, who was less than half his age. For the only time in his life, Jinnah fell in love.
She was young, beautiful, very, very intelligent, very bright. Loved beautiful things. And she was a very humorous, fun person. They had the same sort of interests in the politics and things like that. And he was already a pinnacle in a way. So that was very glamorous. They fell in love. And my grandfather was absolutely appalled, first because of the age difference. I think he was 39 and she was 16. And she came from a prominent Parsi family. And he wasn't too anxious that she should marry out of her community. My father was a Muslim. Distinguished or not, it didn't seem to matter. The moment she was 18, that was it. He walked out and married him.
Rati converted to Islam before the wedding ceremony at Jinnah's home in Bombay. None of her relatives attended. The couple went to Delhi for a brief honeymoon at Maiden's, Jinnah's favorite hotel. Rati's charm and flamboyance became legendary.
We had heard that she was very beautiful, and we were all very excited wanted to see her. She was very beautiful. And she upset my grandmother because she wore a sleeveless blouse and her middle was could be seen. My grandmother resented it. She sent for a dushala. You know what a dushala is? A dushala is that embroidered with gold thread, very heavy. So very diplomatically my grandmother said, dushala lao bua. She covered her up. Said, Bibi, you're a Muslim now. You can't go about naked. So this upset Rati. She complained to her husband. Mr. Jinnah complained to my father that she has insulted my wife. Then Mr. Jinnah never came back while my grandmother was alive.
Jinnah's uncompromising nature was about to drive him into the margins of politics. The First World War over, nationalists in Congress were now demanding immediate self-government for India. In 1920, this provoked a split with Gandhi. Like Jinnah, Gandhi had trained in London as a barrister. But he discarded his lawyer's suit for simple peasant's clothes, and he turned the elitist independence movement into a campaign of mass civil disobedience against the British. Such unconstitutional action was to Jinnah an anathema.
He was, in the very precise European sense, at that juncture, a very secular person. His politics was liberal, his politics was secular. These were the two planks he was pursuing. These were the planks on which his militant nationalism rested. And Gandhi's appeal to religion as the basis of drawing people into politics, particularly as far as the communities of Islam was concerned, because he reached out to the pan-Islamic sentiment of the 20s, Gandhi did. And Jinnah was very unhappy about this.
He gave the answer himself in the speech. He said it will not succeed. You yourself will have to recall the movement which you are launching without proper preparation. You don't know the masses. They will not be able to adhere to the program which you have indicated before them. So first prepare the nation for that. Prepare the people and then embark on any program that you want to launch.
Isolated, Jinnah left Congress. After his final speech, rejecting Gandhi's new tactics, he was booed off stage.
I think that was a great step, and that was, according to me, the first step towards Pakistan.
The loneliness Jinnah experienced in his political life was intensified by the breakdown of his marriage. Rati, increasingly estranged from her husband, sought refuge in mysticism and spirit communication. Eventually, she left Jinnah and moved into Bombay's Taj Hotel.
It had begun with love, but his own stiffness and incapacity for becoming human and relaxed didn't permit him to have the kind of relationship which a lover would have. Husband, certainly, but a British husband, if you like.
Well, what happened is that he was a very, very busy man. He had all his cases. I mean, he had a living to make. And then he had politics. And, you know, a young, beautiful girl, maybe he wasn't able to give her the time that she should have had.
He didn't confide, but she did confide. I knew at that time separation was inevitable. How could two people carry on in life to distance from each other? He in the law court all day and coming back home, even then going to study. And I felt altogether that he couldn't have been happy with an Orthodox Muslim wife in Parda. He could not have been happy with an English woman. He thought this compromise would work because she might become Muslim wife, but she didn't.
Then she fell ill. She fell very ill. And that was very difficult. She died of colitis. But very bad colitis. I believe there are several types of whatever, and I think she had one of the worst. She really was very, very, very sick. I used to visit her when she was so ill, in any case.
And that is the first time when people saw him with tears when he came from Delhi to attend the funeral. And he was a man without any emotions otherwise. It seems it had a great void in his life. He never remarried thereafter. But I knew that he had preserved all the clothes, the photos, and the books of Rati in a very special room. And at the same time, he had kept the proceedings which took place in court, the marriage papers, they were intact.
But I think that he withdrew a lot, you know, not in his work, not in his politics, but I think that he became even more dedicated to his work.
Jinnah decided to leave India. He set sail for England, where he would live for the next 5 years with his sister and daughter. Nothing could have seemed more improbable than that in just a few years, Jinnah would found a nation. Eid Day at the Badshah Mosque in Lahore. Celebrating the end of their annual fast, tens of thousands of Pakistani Muslims gather together. A Muslim political identity was for many the consequence of the religious and cultural differences they experienced living alongside Hindus and Sikhs.
There was a very superficial mixing of the two communities. There was no real intimate friendship. There was a certain amount of wining and dining in each other's homes in the upper class. We had a few Muslim boys at school, but there was not as much coming and going with them as there were between Hindus and Sikhs, where there was no difference at all. Well, the Hindus wouldn't have Muslims in their homes to eat. They had separate dishes for them. If they did ever get a Muslim, they'd get different crockery for them. It had been brought up in me that, you know, for one, the stereotype of the Muslim, you know, that they are unclean, they're not careful of their hygiene, etc. The same as Muslims had about us. So that kind of thing kept a distance between us.
The awareness of difference motivated the 19th century reformer, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, to found a new university at Aligarh. The Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College had the aim of getting more Muslims into government service and the professions. And Sir Syed, concerned that many Muslims were educationally backward compared with Hindus, went on to argue that the two communities, in fact, formed two different nations. In other words, that their religious identities overrode all other distinctions of class, caste, language, or region.
Sir Syed was the first to raise this issue of two nations, I would say, when he pointed out that if the Westminster type of democracy is introduced in the Indian subcontinent, the result of it would be that the majority would keep the minority, Muslim minority, in its hegemony. So therefore, there must be some system which should safeguard the rights of the Muslims. All those who were followers of this viewpoint, they somehow or the other felt that there could not be any genuine understanding between the Hindus and the Muslims. And eventually you can say that it resulted in the secession of Islam from India. But then it was a kind of an idealism which had developed in due course of time, from Sir Sayyid onwards. My father subscribed to this viewpoint.
Today, the poet Muhammad Iqbal is hailed as one of the intellectual founders of Pakistan, a status symbolized by the position of his mausoleum next to Lahore's Badshah Mosque. Iqbal took Sir Said's ideas a stage further, calling for a self-governing state for Muslims, though still within a united India.
Iqbal says that Islamic State in modern times must be based on three principles: human solidarity, human equality, human freedom. He says the ultimate object of Islam is to establish a spiritual democracy. He is the first person to use this expression, spiritual democracy, while explaining what is an modern Islamic state. If you were to come across Jinnah, he also says that the state in Pakistan will be based on Islamic principles.
It is my belief that our salvation lies in following the golden rules of conduct set for us by our great lawgiver, the Prophet of Islam. Let us lay the foundation of our democracy on the basis of truly Islamic ideals and principles. In the early 1930s, Jinnah's adoption of such beliefs was yet to come. He was living in self-imposed exile in London. Prospering as a lawyer, he tried to enter Parliament, standing unsuccessfully as a candidate first for Labour, then for the Conservatives. Meanwhile, in the unlikely setting of suburban South London, a group of Indian students went even further than Iqbal, coming up with the revolutionary idea of a separate state for Muslims.
In Surbiton, London, we had a big dinner and we were thinking of these ideas, various ideas of how can we get freedom, how can we get freedom. And finally it emerged like this: we will have the Muslim state, and what is the name going to be? What name? So we said the first name of the provinces. We had P for Punjab, A for Afghania, K for Kashmir, S for Sindh, and Tan for Balochistan. And we had no idea at that time of East Pakistan joining us, you see. So this is how the word Pakistan was created.
The enthusiastic students took their new plan to Jinnah, now living in Hampstead with his sister Fatima and his daughter Dina.
And when we broached this subject to him, he was absolutely furious. And he said, almost he said, if I can remember quoting him, had it not been for your ages, I would have taken you to be stooges of British imperialism. You're out to break one good the British have done, to unite the heterogeneous elements of India into a united whole. And you're out to break this. Keep away, young men, keep away from there. Something like that.
So at that time, he was still absolutely committed to an Indian union.
Unity.
But in the 1930s, some Muslims in India were becoming worried by Congress. They believed Gandhi, now India's political superstar, was turning it into a Hindu-dominated organization, a charge Congress and its Muslim members fervently denied.
I was deeply affected by what the Congress was doing, what Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was doing, what Mahatma Gandhi was doing. So it was a natural reaction on my side. And I joined the struggle in 1930 when I was a student of the Allahabad University.
Did you feel, as a Muslim, that Congress represented you as much as it did the Hindus?
Oh yes, I had no doubt in my mind. In fact, this seldom occurred to me. I thought the Congress was a nationalist organization comprising of all nationalities and of all communities. And I reacted spontaneously when the struggle started.
The Surbiton students were followed by a succession of Muslim leaders, pleading with Jinnah to return to India and revive the Muslim League. When Jinnah did go home to India, he still wanted to work as an ally of Congress against the British. His plans were wrecked by the elections of 1937. The Muslim League got a paltry 21% of the Muslim vote. Jinnah lost any muscle to force an accommodation with Congress.
It's the day he realized that, and he injected communalism in politics. Mr. Gandhi, I say. And Mr. Jinnah resented that. And he says, you are trying to Hinduize politics. He felt the Hindu being in perpetual majority, they will wipe out the Muslims. And Muslims will remain only serfs and will be totally dominated by the Hindu majority.
Under Congress rule, many Muslims would complain of discrimination and a rise in communal violence. The victorious Congress leader, Jawaharlal Nehru, insisted his party alone represented the Indian people and saw no reason to share power with Jinnah.
The charge is also laid against Nehru that if he had included the representatives, possibly the demand for partition wouldn't have arisen. Well, it is not easy to foresee events. Assuming we knew that this would result in the partition of the country, we could have taken a different line.
Nehru addressed a convention of Congress members, and he said that there are only two powers in the land, the British and the Congress. Then Quaid-e-Azam said, no, there was third party, and that's Muslims.
Zia-ud-Din Suleri used to go to Muslim League meetings to hear Jinnah speak. He saw how Jinnah, defeated in the election and rejected by Nehru, now embarked on a new mass strategy to build up Muslim support. His rallying call became Islam in danger. Jinnah symbolically discarded his Savile Row suit and appeared in traditional Muslim dress. He advocated the two-nation theory and turned to exactly the kind of populist religious politics which had once caused him to fall out with Gandhi. At the 1938 Muslim League conference in Patna, Jinnah accused Congress of being only a Hindu body.
The speech that Mr. Jinnah made there was a bitter attack on the Congress. So bitter that Gandhi was obliged to make a reply. And I think, to my mind, that was the beginning. Patna was the beginning of the mass movement of the Muslim League.
Popular response was tremendous, there's no question about it, because you see, he gave the impression that here is the savior of Muslims from Hindu domination because of his brilliance, because of his cleverness, because of his incorruptible style of functioning. He was highly respected, there's no denying that.
The League was now turning into a mass movement of Indian Muslims, thanks to Jinnah's new line. It had a particular appeal for the young.
We went to the race course, and there we saw the stately-looking person. We were introduced, and when he heard that we were from part of Quetta, he said that I'd like you to come and have lunch with me tomorrow, and we can discuss more. Then he asked if there was a Muslim League in Quetta, which I said, no, there wasn't. So he says, well, that's something you've got to get about, forming a Muslim League in Baluchistan. And we went to lunch the next day, and a great deal was discussed and a great deal was said how it should be opened and what should be done to form a Muslim League in Baluchistan.
Piari Rashid's husband, Qazi Isa, became Jinnah's key man in Baluchistan and his host.
During that period, my father from Bhopal had sent a special cook to make luxurious dishes for him, but of course he wouldn't participate. And whenever you asked him what he'd like for a dessert, he always said, "I'd like to have some baked custard." He was very fond of baked custard. He could have it twice a day at every meal, if it was possible for him to do so, I think.
When the Second World War broke out in Europe, London declared that India too was at war. But Congress was divided, and Nehru and Gandhi spent much of the war in prison. The British turned to the Muslim League for support and asked Jinnah what he wanted in return. Jinnah was uncertain. He asked his political secretary for some ideas.
He said, "Could you please give me a sort of brief for your own ideas on this?" And I knew what the lines that the demand for Pakistan, or the idea of Pakistan, was following. And I prepared about, I think it was 2 or 3 pages of notes, mainly based on that file. And I gave it to him.
My father, and along with his advisors and members of the committee, spent hours with him trying to persuade him to understand the benefit of Pakistan coming into being. And that was the arguments which went on for hours and hours at my home in Karachi.
So in other words, he was persuaded by events rather than taking the initiative.
Yes, he was forced by the events which took place. This is a real, straightforward truth.
Jinnah was being pushed towards a destination he'd never originally sought. In 1940, Muslims from all over India gathered in Lahore for a momentous session of the Muslim League. Jinnah took the train from Delhi.
I would call it a Pakistan special or something. With the entire leadership being carried in one train. In the center there was a compartment in which he, his sister, Mr. Jinnah, and myself. And the train pulled up. And the leaders, Muslim leaders who had come to receive him, they were pushed by the volunteers in the crowd. Nobody knew who was where. He stood at the door and he said, "Look, if you don't behave, I'm going to go back." And then he shouted, "Discipline!" And the entire lot was absolutely silent. And I'm sure a number of those people did not even know what discipline meant. I mean, English word.
Jinnah addressed the crowd at Lahore's Minto Park for nearly 2 hours. But the future founder of Pakistan could only speak fluently in English.
My father was explaining to me what he was saying. And I did ask him, I said, "He's speaking in English. And do the people understand?" He said, "They've trusted him, so they know what he's saying."
This old man was asked, "Do you know what he's saying? He's talking in English." He said, "I don't know what he's saying, but I know for definite whatever he's saying is the right thing."
He was explaining at that time that the only answer is a separate homeland for the Muslims of India. We have tried all kinds of solutions with other communities and with the British, but unfortunately it has not come to anything. And we have come to this conclusion that now the final solution is that there should be 2 states, Muslim India and Hindu India. And people understood.
The Lahore session passed a resolution demanding that areas in the northeast and northwest of India, where the Muslims were a majority, should become independent states. But the resolution was deliberately vague as to whether these states should be inside or outside of federal India.
It just partially advocated the concept of a separate Muslim state, but there were so many loopholes in it, and these loopholes indicated that there was still time if there could be any rapprochement between the Hindus and the Muslims.
While his followers believed he was talking about a separate Pakistan, for Jinnah it was more of a maximum demand. He was now called Qaid-e-Azam, the great leader. By employing the imagery and symbolism of Islam, he'd found he could fire the Muslim masses. But how orthodox a Muslim was he?
He was not a religious man, but he wasn't irreligious either. There was no big religious thing.
I asked Mr. Jinnah to say the prayers. He was a bit nervous about it because there were hundreds of thousands of people looking at him all the time. We tried to explain to him that prayer is much more important to the masses because they feel that if we are talking of a Muslim homeland, religion should come first. And that's how Mr. Jinnah accepted the position.
Some mullahs were suspicious of Jinnah's new commitment to Islam. They opposed the Pakistan idea because they feared it would be un-Islamic, and even issued fatwas against some League members.
They thought Pakistan, when it is established, it will be a secular state like Turkey. Because all those who are supporting this movement for Pakistan, their approach, according to them, was not really purely Islamic. It was the westernized version of Islam.
In other words, that Islam was safer within an undivided India than it was within a Muslim state.
Yes, exactly. This is what their impression was, and that's why they opposed the Pakistan movement.
Much of the movement's dynamism was coming from the Muslim University at Aligarh, birthplace of the two-nation theory, and now the center of Muslim League youth activity.
When I went to Aligarh, I think it was for the first time that I saw Mr. Jinnah. Tall, handsome, confident, bold. I was definitely attracted by his personality. He galvanized the Muslim masses. He awakened their consciousness and spirit, and a sense of destiny and identity. He declared that Aligarh especially was the arsenal of Muslim India. And most of us, most of the students, not only from Aligarh but from other colleges and universities, Muslim students, were trained in special camps so that they could contact each and every voter for the battle that was to be fought.
The Pakistan idea was spreading into the markets and mosques of Muslim India. Some young enthusiasts distributed news sheets to convince the Muslims that they were being done down by the Hindus.
हम कोशिश कर रहे थे कि मुसलमानों को बताएं कि तुम्हारी जो इक्तिसादी हालत है और तुम्हारी तमाम तजारत हिंदुओं के हाथ में है, जो अंग्रेज़ के अपने आदमी है, और गरीब जो है गरीब से गरीबतर होते जा रहे हैं। ये जो देहात है, छोटे छोटे गांव में जो थे हिंदू, हमारे मुसलमानों को चीज़ें कर्ज पे देते थे, फिर जिस उनका फसल उठता था उस फसल में वो पैसा देते, फिर उस पर सूद भी लेते थे। चुनांचे बहुत सी ज़मीनें मुसलमानों का जो है हिंदुओं ने उस कर्ज के बदले में रख लिया था। तो यहाँ के लोगों को जो है हिंदुओं के इस अमल के खिलाफ बहुत नफरत थी, बहुत शिकायत।
In 1942, with the fall of Singapore and Rangoon, the war reached India's doorstep. The British government, desperate for India's help, sent Cabinet Minister Sir Stafford Cripps to win over Congress and the Muslim League.
And we hope that the Indian leaders will give the help they have already promised us as regards the mobilization of that great people in the protection of their own country.
In exchange for Jinnah's cooperation, Cripps conceded that any province could opt out of a future independent India. But Jinnah, now raising the stakes, rejected the offer on the grounds that Pakistan was not explicitly named. Jinnah was talking tough, but his purpose was still unclear. Did he want his Pakistan to stay within India or to become a new separate state? Meanwhile, Jinnah's daughter Dina had announced that she wanted to marry a non-Muslim. Though Jinnah himself had married a Parsi, the Qaidi-Azam could not accept his own daughter behaving likewise.
He wasn't too happy because I think it was a crucial time all around.
And he would have preferred it in some ways if you'd married a Muslim?
Most probably, yes, absolutely.
Did it lead to any change in your relations with him?
Yes, it did. He was very disapproving, and we didn't speak for a few years.
The breach between father and daughter was only healed after a member of a rival Muslim party tried to murder Jinnah, having talked his way into the house in Bombay.
In 1943, it was in July, when an attempt was made on his life. That was about 1 o'clock or 1:15. I used to come at about 2, and I did come at 2 o'clock, and I learned that he had just escaped and doctors have bandaged, and he was resting in the bedroom. I went there.
He fought off the man. And what happened was that this man came with a knife. And my father was struggling with him, so the knife got him, and the chauffeur, his driver was in the driveway, ran, and he was a big baton, and he just got him off.
The first thing he again inquired from me is to ensure that the press statement has been released that the assassin was a Muslim. He says otherwise there could be riots. Then all of a sudden Dina came in and straight went to his bedroom. They were closeted for about 20 minutes or half an hour, and then she left. That's the first time that I saw her.
In September 1944, the house on Malabar Hill was the scene of lengthy negotiations between Jinnah and Gandhi, his old adversary, who had recently been released from detention. The Mahatma journeyed to Jinnah, still hoping to persuade him back into the all-India fold.
I think like two stalwarts doing a case, each recognized the merit of the other and was trying to find a weakness in the point of view of the other.
I think Gandhi realized that he was up against a sort of rock, as it were, who wasn't going to budge. And Jinnah realized he was up against a very clever fellow, which he was.
And both were a match for each other. Now, for example, the famous incident where in the very first day, Mr. Gandhi said, "You have mesmerized the Muslims." Mr. Jinnah retorted, "You have hypnotized the Hindus."
But the talks got nowhere. The two men stuck to their old positions. Gandhi refused to accept that India contained two nations of Hindus and Muslims. Jinnah insisted on their separateness.
Mr. Jinnah claimed that he will only represent the Muslims. And Mr. Gandhi said he's representing whole of India. And Mr. Jinnah cornered him and says, "No, you cannot. You can at the most say that you are representing the Congress. And Congress in turn represents predominantly the Hindus."
That was another stumbling block in our way. Now, we couldn't say that Congress is a Hindu organization. It was impossible for us to say it because we were not a Hindu organization. Congress was a nationalist organization comprising of all nationalities and all communities. If I participated in the struggle for freedom, it is as an Indian, not exactly as a Muslim.
The talks may have failed, but Jinnah's status was heightened simply by the Mahatma's public recognition of him. Jinnah's secretary, Sharifuddin Pirzada, was present throughout.
Mr. Jinnah's point was that he will make his best efforts to convince Mr. Gandhi about the possibility of establishment of Pakistan. At least he should accept the principle. Then the details can be worked out subsequently. So Mr. Jinnah was able to project Pakistan in this way. And these talks more or less received international notice.
For Gandhi, the talks were a disaster. For Jinnah, they were an inspiration. He was now touring India, building the Muslim League as a mass movement. Whenever he visited the Punjabi capital, Lahore, he would stay among the students of Islamia College. Ishlal Zaidi was one.
Once I remember, somebody from us asked a rather naive question. He said, Qaid, everybody is saying that Mr. Gandhi travels by a third-class train, but you travel by first class and you live in these huge houses and he lives very simply. And he became thoughtful, but he said, look, the two things. One is a leader should show himself what he is, and the people must accept him what he is. I do not live in double life. There has to be a transparency.
With Gandhi and Jinnah at loggerheads, the Viceroy, Lord Wavell, who believed independence was now inevitable, called a conference at the hill resort of Simla to discuss membership of a transitional government. Jinnah insisted that all Muslims in any such government had to be members of his Muslim League, cutting out Muslims who belonged to Congress and other parties. The talks collapsed.
The political significance of it was that he wanted that whatever constitutional arrangement that Britain arrives at, it has to have his approval, and he would not give the approval unless he was recognized on the same level, on par with Gandhi. That was the whole trouble with him. That is why he ridiculed the Congress Muslims like me. He ridiculed all those people who disagreed with him. Gandhi was not half as dictatorial as Jinnah was. Gandhi believed in carrying people with him. Jinnah sort of dictated.
At last, Labour is in power in Britain, and here are some members of the new government, the Prime Minister and Sir Stafford Cripps.
The new Labour government in London promised independence for India. It decided to call elections, the first since 1937, to assess the strengths of Congress and the Muslim League.
And we decided to go to the villages and small towns and gave them the message of Muslim League, that why did we want a separate homeland for the Muslims? The impact was electric, absolutely.
League support was growing all the time, but Congress was blind to it. Its leaders, like Nehru, had spent the last 3 years of the war in prison and completely underestimated Jinnah's mass appeal.
Nehru got frightfully angry, and I could see him now standing by his fireplace, and he started yelling at me, and he almost hit me. He said, no, you're absolutely wrong. They're just a myth. They're nothing at all. They're just the imagination of the British. I said, I think you'll find they're not. And I talked to him for 4 hours. And at the end, he calmed down. He said, well, maybe we will have to do something about the Muslim League. So he was just beginning to see the light. But you see, he'd been away in jail so often, and he hadn't realized the enormous pressures that had been building up of resentment against the high-handed methods of Congress.
In Karachi, he always came to stay with us because he was very friendly with my father. And my father adored him. Then on the polling day, he asked us how the voting went. And I was very excited. And I turned around to him and I said, it went very, very well. Main factor is, you know, I even put in a couple of fake votes. And he said to me, suddenly, the conversation ended, stony silence. And I said, yes, I changed burqas, you know. Everybody wears burqas. I said, I mean, change burqas 3 times to go in and give. And the polling agents were all very pro us. At which he turned around and he said, I'm very sorry you did that, because I have no intention of getting Pakistan on in that way. I want it to be a fair election. And I'm sorry you've done that. And I would like you to go back and remove those 3 votes from the voters list, because you have no right to do it.
The League won almost 90% of the Muslim vote in the elections. It was now clearly the authentic voice of Muslim nationalism. Its victory sharpened religious differences throughout North India. With the rising tension, the British government wanted to get out of India as soon as possible. Cripps returned with 2 other cabinet ministers to negotiate with the Indian leaders.
It was known, Weymouth reported it back to London, but I'd got on very well with Jinnah and the Muslim League. And so my specific role began as being the liaison with Jinnah, because Cripps couldn't bear to be in the same room with him. Well, he had compulsion rather than charm. I mean, he makes you listen to him.
Jinnah now showed, even at this late stage, that he was still far from committed to a total breakaway. On the 16th of May 1946, the mission published its plan. It proposed a system of government which would reassure Muslims by grouping the Muslim provinces into units with a large measure of autonomy, but still remaining inside a united India. It was the last chance of avoiding partition. Everything now depended on Jinnah. Would he agree to such a plan when it meant going back on the Pakistan demand?
This is, I think, one of the amazing things in history. Till May 1946, for the last 6 years, everybody was talking about a separate homeland and Pakistan. And then Quaid-e-Azam, in his wisdom, thought that, well, we can give another trial to a cabinet mission scheme because it was for a period of 10 years and we'll see how it works, which means temporarily going back on Pakistan. There was going to be a center. And when he announced, there was not one person who opposed this. Said, well, because Quaid-e-Azam has said it, so it must be the right thing to do.
I was the president then of the Muslim League in Sindh. We accepted that situation and said that if there are the safeguards, we would give up the idea of Pakistan and wait. If the safeguards which Mr. Jinnah had put forward were accepted, I think the masses would have accepted it.
But the British offer was torpedoed, not by Jinnah, but by Congress's President Nehru, who rejected outright the scheme for the grouping of Muslim provinces.
After Nehru's press conference in 1946, when he became the Congress president, replacing Azad, and he said, we will go in the Constituent Assembly unfettered. We will do what we want. And then Jinnah said, I can never trust these people. Even when they agree, they go back. And Sardar Patel described that on the part of Nehru as an act of emotional insanity. That was the most tragic moment in India's history.
Next, I'll try to lift
He never really wanted to break away. You know, he thought India everybody could live together and come to terms with the Congress party or the Hindu government or whoever was going to be in charge. And as history tells us, it wasn't to be.
Jinnah was finally pushed over the edge. It was the defining moment. He demanded a sovereign state of Pakistan and called a Muslim League Day of Action. In unleashing the power of the masses, he was for the first time turning his back on constitutional methods as well as a united India. In Calcutta, 5,000 people were killed.
And I saw for the first time what riot does to people. I saw a man, you know, his throat cut. There was just this awful feeling of doom or of great disaster because people were being killed, which one had not thought would happen. And that was 1946. And that changed the whole of the complexion of the thing completely.
هغه نه بعد بیا لوی واقعیا د بهار د هندو مسلم فساد کې بیا قائد اعظم حکم وکړ چې صوبه سرحد نه هغلته خپلو مسلمانانو وروڼو لپاره دغه تلل پکار دي. هلته هم د هغه مسلمانانو خدمت وکړو. هلته نه ما د ډیډ باډیز ماشومانو لاسونه او خپې او د کپرې مپرې څه طریقې سره سیف کړي او مې راوړې دلته او دې قبایلو کې مې ویشلې وې چې دا وګورئ چې د هندوانو بچۍ در باندې راغله نو دا حل به مې دلته هلته چې مسلمانان کم دي نو د هغې په زرګونو باندې زرګونو مسلمانان هغې کریش کړه.
He didn't like emotionalism. He didn't encourage emotionalism. That's why I don't think he'll encourage rioting, because he did make a mob into a nation. He wanted to make a mob into a nation. He did succeed 3/4 of it. But the mob sort of reverted and became a mob. And I think that was a matter of great sorrow to him.
Reports of the massacres inspired Prime Minister Attlee to try one last time and get Congress and the League to agree to a settlement. But the time had passed when either Nehru or Jinnah would make concessions.
I am on my mission, and I can tell you nothing about the present. That's all I can say.
After the London conference, in a radio talk, Jinnah did say what he wanted, very clearly.
Hindu India and Muslim India must be separated, because the two nations are entirely distinct and different, and in some matters antagonistic to each other. Let me tell you some of the differences. History, culture, language, architecture, music, laws, jurisprudence, calendar, and our entire social fabric and code of life. One India is impossible realization. It will inevitably mean that the Muslim will be transferred from the domination of the British to the caste Hindu rule. But freedom must mean freedom both from the British exploitation and Hindu domination. 100 millions of Muslims will never agree merely to a change of masters.
A lawyer to the core, Jinnah had become the advocate of the Muslim cause. He now seemed on the point of winning his greatest case. But what really motivated him?
Well, he had obviously genuine love of Muslims and his people. That was without any doubt. And I tell you another thing that motivated him. He was a lawyer brought up in England, and lawyers in England have a curious habit of believing in justice. And so he didn't want injustice done to his people, and he was going to fight for it.
Jinnah's concept of Pakistan included an undivided Punjab and Bengal, but Muslims there were only a small majority. He now had to get the best he could in the empire endgame. In February 1947, Prime Minister Attlee announced the British would leave India by June the following year. With the end of British rule in sight, the Muslim League in Punjab stepped up its civil disobedience campaign. Sikhs and Hindus fought back.
And the violence was then started about March 1947. So it was really the entire Muslim population. Every day they would just come out on the streets, were beaten up, they were tear gassing. But the government realized that every day the gathering and the numbers were bigger than before. Starting from Lahore, they went to the other places like Amritsar, to Rawalpindi, to Jalandhar, all the other towns.
There was a danger of a complete collapse of the central authority. This was the danger of the situation. And the talk about there having been a scuttle and a rush at the end is simply the reverse of the truth. The truth is that it had gone on far too long. The whole discussion, the transfer of power had been under discussion with the same leaders for nearly 5 years. In March 1947, the last Viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, descended on India. The British and Congress had grudgingly accepted that India would have to be divided. I think under the terms of reference that Mountbatten had, partition was inevitable. We were officially required to try and revive the cabinet mission plan. But the cabinet mission plan was a plan that involved a weak central government. And a weak central government was not going to be able to govern.
If Jinnah was to have his Pakistan, Mountbatten, whose sympathies lay with Nehru, was determined it should be as small as possible. Only those districts of Bengal and Punjab where the Muslims were in a majority would be included. Mountbatten feared that Jinnah would reject his plan for a truncated Pakistan. But time was not on Jinnah's side. He was now 70 and not in good health. One evening after the talks, Mountbatten's chief of staff, Lord Ismay, reported that Jinnah seemed ready to take whatever he could get.
Towards the end of the dinner, someone asked the question, how did the talks go? And Ismay, getting hold of a cigarette, a matchbox, which lay on the table for lighting cigars, and saying, today I had the impression that if I wrote Pakistan on this matchbox, Mr. Jinnah would accept it.
In point of fact, the actual decision to accept the plan was made on his behalf by Mountbatten. And all he did was to nod his head, which is all he had to do. He didn't nod his head the wrong way. He nodded it in a nodding of acceptance. And that was in fact, the actual token agreement which made possible the June the 3rd plan to be announced and the Government of India Act to be passed and all the rest of the transaction.
We must remember that we have to take momentous decisions and handle grave issues facing us in the solution of the complex political problem of this great subcontinent inhabited by 400 millions of people.
I was in Bombay, my house, and he phoned, and he said, we've got it. I said, got it, you know, what's, and he said, Pakistan. I said, well, you've worked hard for it. And then we had a personal conversation, and that was it. I never saw him again, but he went to Pakistan.
On the 7th of August 1947, Jinnah arrived in Karachi, his new capital. He was greeted by thousands of Muslims shouting, Pakistan Zindabad, long live Pakistan. The world's biggest Muslim state as yet had no government. Jinnah's first task was to build an administration out of the chaos he found in Karachi. But the strain showed, and by the time he was sworn in as Pakistan's first head of state, he was an exhausted man.
The reception tired out Mr. Jinnah, and he gradually moved from the crowd in the lawn onto the terrace and said to one of us, tell Mountbatten I'm tired and I'd like to leave. And so Mountbatten came and he said something about you know, he will get used to these occasions and so on. But he didn't make an allowance for the fact none of us knew that he was ill.
The newborn state was also in delicate health. Almost immediately, relations with India were poisoned by the conflict over Kashmir. At partition, the state's Hindu Maharaja had wanted to accede to India, but conscious of the pro-Pakistan wishes of his overwhelmingly Muslim people, he refused to commit himself. A self-governing Azad Kashmir was declared when Muslims in the west of the state took matters into their own hands.
In October 1947, 5,000 armed Pakistani tribesmen entered Kashmir to defend them from attacks by state troops. 2 days later, the Maharaja declared for India and called for its military support. Jinnah flew to Lahore to discuss the crisis with Mountbatten.
Mountbatten's attitude to the Kashmir crisis was that it was a terrifying development, that having achieved a settlement which had the great advantage of allowing both countries to enjoy status in the British Commonwealth, it would be a terrible thing if two Commonwealth countries were at war with each other within 3 months of getting their own power.
Jinnah was dissuaded from military intervention when the British threatened to withdraw all officers serving in the fledgling Pakistan Army. He remained in Lahore, depressed and ill. A few months later, his health worsening from the lung cancer which was to kill him, he withdrew to the cool mountain retreat of Ziyarat in Baluchistan.
I have a feeling that his body clock had told him that he was going. But he wanted to prolong it as much as he could, to see Pakistan firmly on its feet. And I have no doubt those 4 months in Quetta and Ziyarat did prolong his life. I think he was much more relaxed. He wasn't burdened with affairs of the state to the same degree as he was in Karachi. And he knew that he must recoup so as to give some more time of his life to the state that he had founded.
We were informed that Jinnah was very poorly, and I and also Bob Harrison, who was a pilot, approached the naval aide-de-camp and said, please, if you possibly can, arrange for Jinnah to get aboard the aircraft as soon as possible, because it's going to be very bumpy indeed later in the day.
We drove down in the ambulance to the airstrip. There was no airport. And we took him out. And as we were carrying the stretcher, I remember Mazhar was on one side and I was on the other. A gust of wind came and blew this white sheet on his face. He moved the sheet away. As he neared the doorway of the plane, the crew had lined up. They gave a salute, and he returned it with his hand. So he was very much, he had all his faculties intact.
He was helped aboard, and directly he arrived in the saloon, they converted 2 of the easy armchairs to a bed, and he then rested in that bed. We took off at 2:10 in the afternoon, which is one of the worst times for turbulence. Flying over terrain which was rugged, up to 5,000 feet, and we had all the heat of the day causing turbulence. So I went to the door leading into the saloon, and as it so happened, I was looking directly at Jinnah as he was propped up on his pillows. And he could obviously see the concern on my face, because he gave me the most wonderful smile, a smile I shall never forget. And it was a smile that said, don't be concerned, all is well, and all will be well.
We got there 6:30. We put him in a little room on the ground floor. You know, there was so much happening. People were coming in and going out, and I think the doctor came in, one of these two, either Dr. Rai-Baksh or Dr. Mistry, and they just threw their stethoscopes on the sofa and slumped back. So I sensed it, and I got up, walked out, and I went in and I saw, yes, they had covered his face.
And Miss Jinnah was weeping, sitting beside him.
While Jinnah repeatedly stressed that Pakistan should be based on Islamic principles, in a speech to the new Constituent Assembly, he'd indicated what sort of state he'd really wanted to create. Tolerant in his interpretation of Islam, he seemed also to reveal his old liberalism, as well as his lifelong concern for the rights of all. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state. You will find that in course of time, Hindus would cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims, not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense, as citizens of the state.